Hey guys, here's another episode that has data that's very interesting to hear, I hope, but not necessarily to look at visually. So rather than show you a whole bunch of charts and statistics, I'm going to give you some more lovely travelogue footage. So here is my hometown of Lynn, Massachusetts. And here is the Atlantic Ocean. And here is the 19th century seawall that protects my hometown from the Atlantic Ocean. Kinda pretty, no? Well, water is soothing, so let's get to it. Once upon a time, conventional wisdom was that diseases were caused by bad blood, and to cure them one simply needed to drain a bunch of blood and start fresh. Conventional wisdom was wrong. Once upon a time, conventional wisdom was that the only way to make profitable movies about comic book superheroes was to focus on well-known properties like Superman or Batman, and not second stringers like Iron Man or Blade. Conventional wisdom was wrong again. Today, conventional wisdom says that Sony, despite being an electronics company that only got into gaming relatively recently, has built up a brand as sturdy and reliable as those seen in the golden age of Nintendo and SEGA, perhaps even greater. Conventional wisdom might be wrong about that too. Is it possible that, good games or not, we've all been giving Sony way more credit than they deserve, even in regard to their inarguable successes? Is it possible that we've all been wrong, and Sony actually has next to no actual skill for the video game business? Is it possible that the unprecedented 2 generations of PlayStation market dominance owed less to the arrival of some potent new force in gaming, and more to luck? Is it possible that the Emperor has no clothes? For a while there, it sure didn't look like it. The original PlayStation did what Philips and even Apple couldn't do, an outsider success in the closed-off world of video game consoles. The PS2, boasting possibly the best modern lifetime lineup of great software outside possibly the GBA, was cited as the driving force behind the DVD boom. Those are huge achievements that changed the face of gaming, and no one can deny them. But since the tail end of the PS2's lifespan, things haven't been so rosy. The PSP was supposed to end a decade and change of de facto Nintendo monopoly on handhelds, but it met the same fate as everyone else who's tried to do the same thing. The PS3 came into the current generation as the presumed top dog, but instead, it's been consistently slapped down by a surging Microsoft and the Nintendo revival that nobody saw coming. What went wrong? Well, who's to say something has to have gone wrong? There was no great change in tactics or business model. The tepid launch of the PS3 and the ongoing disaster of the PSP both mirrored the successful run of the PS2, right down to an early focus on new media storage disc formats. What if this is just what it looks like when Sony's video game division goes up against legitimate competition? What if the first 2 PlayStations were lucky breaks and Sony simply isn't all that good at running a game company? Heavy claim, I realize, and one that's going to need some history to back it up. So pop some popcorn, pull up a chair, and let's all journey back through the mists of time to the year 1991. The Soviet Union had just dissolved. Comedy Central was born. Kevin Peter Hall died. The United States went to war with Iraq, and won, and did only exactly what they said they were going to do in the first place, and then came home right away. What a crazy strategy. And somewhere deep in the Minato ward of Tokyo City, the powerful Sony Corporation had no intention of starting a video game company, but what they did have was foresight. See, back then, no universal format existed for the digital storage of anything, especially game consoles. Everything was proprietary. Proprietary cartridges housed proprietary software made to interface with proprietary hardware. The whole industry was run top to bottom by entities devoted solely to the development of video games. It wasn't a model that could last. Once CD-ROM technology became a reality, everyone knew that an arms race to incorporate it into console gaming was soon to follow. This was a problem for the game companies of the time, partly because they'd only ever made proprietary technology, and partly because the industry itself simply wasn't as big back then. They weren't equipped to suddenly start producing disc-based devices, or discs for that matter. They'd need to partner up with larger, more general electronics companies to achieve these ends, and SEGA, ever the make-it-up-as-you-go risk-takers of gaming's golden age, jumped first, partnering up with JVC and Pioneer and others for the SEGA CD add-on in 1992. The less said about it, the better. While Sega made it to market first, their chief rival Nintendo was right behind them. In fact, they'd been working toward a CD-based console since 1986. Their partner was Sony. Now, just to clarify for all you younglings out there, you know how Nintendo today is this happy-go-lucky scamp that treats its business dealings like, oh gosh, where'd all this money come from? Well, that didn't exist back then. 90s Nintendo was a big, lumbering tyrant that stomped around the gaming world like they owned the place, mostly because they kinda did. If there was a negative stereotype of a Japanese megacorporation, they worked their hardest to embody it. They used the proprietary nature of the cartridge era to rule gaming with an iron fist. If you didn't play by their rules as a licensee, you didn't get your chips. And since CDs meant having to share with Sony and losing some of that control by paying someone else for software materials, they started looking to back out of the deal as soon as they got into it, even though they kept on developing the device anyway. At the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, Nintendo pulled what may be the single biggest dick move in the history of the industry, and in doing so, changed the course of gaming as we know it. See, they let Sony go on stage and wow crowds with a prototype of a Super NES with a built-in CD-ROM drive, without telling Sony that they'd already decided to go in a different direction, a long time ago. One day later, Nintendo formally announced that they were scrapping the project and teaming up with Philips instead. Now folks, there are things you just don't do in the Japanese business world, and thing number one is publicly humiliating a partner. Sony, especially Ken Kutaragi, was pissed. They'd been left metaphorically holding their dicks in the middle of nowhere, but they were also holding something else. Plans. See, while Nintendo had been jerking them around, Kutaragi and his team had front row seats to the ultimate masterclass in how to run a console business, and now they planned to use that education and the technology they'd developed to take karmic revenge on their would-be partner. Sony would make their own game console, the PlayStation. It was a huge risk, but third-party game developers, wary of an increasingly unsure SEGA and dreading the prospect of an even more iron-fisted Nintendo juggernaut, were eager to see someone succeed. Now, as origin stories go, that's a good one, and you have to give Sony credit for taking a big risk and showing strong business initiative. Whatever else has happened since, letting Kutaragi take such a big gamble on a project primarily out of honor code revenge was pretty stand-up, even though they did shove the project off onto Sony Music to make it cost-effective. But beyond that, did you notice that they didn't really do much of anything? Thinking on their feet or not, their role in the story was almost entirely reactionary. Principally, they were the beneficiaries of monumentally bad decision-making on Nintendo's part and Sega's agonizingly slow collapse. They happened to be in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment. In other words, they got lucky. And the good luck kept on coming. The PS1's first wave of software didn't exactly set the world on fire, but everyone else was having bigger problems. They got on better with Philips, but Nintendo just would not let go of the extra money and control that came from the cartridge format. So the SNES ended up not getting a CD add-on. Instead, Philips got to make their own console, the CDI, and release games with licensed Nintendo characters on it. And by now, we've all seen how that worked out. Meanwhile, the House of Mario stuck with carts for the N64. Initially, the load-time-free nature of the format allowed for the creation of ahead-of-their-time masterpieces like Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, but soon space limitations and the cost associated with production would lose them the support of even more frustrated third parties. Matsushita, better known today as Panasonic, developed a machine called the M2 that never actually made it to market. And Sega, poor Sega, just couldn't keep their shit together. The competition kept fucking up, and Sony kept reaping all the benefits. In the run-up to the PS2, Sony would make their second and thus far final genuinely savvy move in the entire gaming career, recognizing that making the system a DVD player as well would be a good long-term investment. And while it would lead to the fixation on multimedia that would eventually kneecap their next two launches, it worked. The PS2 fueled the DVD explosion, and the DVD explosion fueled the PS2. But aside from that, the events that helped Sony the most were those it had absolutely no control over. Nintendo's GameCube did finally embrace discs. Special Nintendo-only discs. And while Microsoft's gambit to bring PC-style gaming to the console scene with the Xbox made news, Japanese xenophobia against an American-made console and apathy toward first-person shooters made sure that they were no competition whatsoever for Sony in what was then still the mecca of video games. Although it did turn out that Westerners love FPSs so much that one was enough to salvage the entire experiment. So, there you have it. 2 generations defined by dominant Sony consoles, but also 2 generations defined by competitors being shut out of whole markets or making catastrophic business mistakes. Console gaming at the turn of the millennium was the kingdom of the blind, and Sony was the man with one eye. But what would it have looked like if they had faced real, strong competitors? In 2004, we found out, when Sony decided to take on the handheld market. Almost from the get-go, it was clear that Sony had no real understanding of how the portable gaming scene actually worked. The long list of graphics-focused failures like the Game Gear, Turbo Express, and Lynx versus the ever-unstoppable yet ever 5 years behind the cutting-edge Game Boy brand were legendary. But Sony ignored the history and made all the same mistakes everyone else had. They emphasized graphics despite their limited importance in the world of small screens and varying light conditions. And they launched mostly with bite-sized versions of console hits. Finally, looking to repeat the PS2's DVD crossover success, they went all in on a new media format, UMD Minis, and this time, it didn't work. Any historian of handheld gaming can tell you where they went wrong, aside from just failing to produce any major games up front. It wasn't a well-positioned travel device, nobody wanted to rebuy their movies as UMDs, its multifaceted connectivity made it a pirate's dream machine, and it had precious little to offer some of the handheld market's biggest spending niches, younger kids, women, and college-age retro gamers. And that was before Nintendo lured the elderly into the mix too. Where was the PSP's answer to Brain Age? Or Pokemon, for that matter? And how did they expect to get by without them? Today, the system holds the distinction of being the handheld that got clobbered the least violently by the Game Boy/DS, and it gets by primarily on a smattering of JRPGs and Japan's fixation on the Monster Hunter franchise. How could this happen to the same people who made the PS2? But remember, Sony never evidenced much real sense of what made or didn't make a hit game. Hell, Final Fantasy VII was called the game that sold the PlayStation, and it wasn't even a title Sony had sought out. They got it because Square was mad at Nintendo for sticking with cartridges. Sony ran the floor in a console war where their only competition was a stumbling, hunkered-down Nintendo, a dying SEGA, and a Microsoft getting lugged across the battlefield on the shoulders of the least interesting game hero of all time. Congratulations there, Godzilla. You just beat up Grammy, Gummy, Sanrio, and a couch. But playing in the handheld world, a market where the old warhorse was still at full power, they got their ass kicked. They got their ass kicked so bad they resorted to using a live-action Poochie as a last-ditch effort to move units. Yeah, by the way, memo to Sony.
Everyone hates this fucking kid.
And isn't it funny how the Marcus spots are all about how much better the PSP is than the iPhone? What? You mean full games are better than apps? Wicked shaka. How classic is that? We know we can't compete against our actual rival, so instead we're going to pretend to actually be in competition with someone in a totally different business. This would be like if the Red Sox called a press conference and said, guys, New York is just fielding too good a team this year. We ain't going to win the playoffs. So instead, we're going to focus on how much our home run record stacks up against, the Lakers. Now initially, the PSP's relative failure seemed like an anomaly. As the next wave of home consoles took shape, most assumed the prevailing circumstances would continue. The PS3 would be every bit the juggernaut the PS2 was, the Xbox 360 would just keep on spending Bill Gates' money, and whatever the hell Nintendo was up to, it'd probably involve relying on devoted fans and old-school franchises to just squeak by. But then the wind changed. Microsoft had been taking notes last time. The Xbox lagged behind the PS2 in sales and never caught on at all in what had always been modern gaming's most important bellwether market. But thanks largely to the mainstream breakout of hits like Madden, Guitar Hero, the FPS explosion, and the unexpected mega-popularity of online multiplayer on consoles, the US market had expanded by leaps and bounds. For the first time in 2 decades, it might actually be possible to have a creative and financial success with a console that only Western gamers gave a shit about. And Nintendo? What else needs to be said? Fortune may favor the bold, but building the Wii around an entirely new control scheme, eschewing HD and launching with a campaign to turn everyone into a gamer, was the single biggest saving throw taken by a game company since they'd brought the NES to American shores. But it worked. Boy, did it work. The financial side of the current console war was over almost as soon as it started, and after a decade and change in exile, overnight the king took back his crown. But what of the PS3? Its power? Undeniable. Its potential? Unlimited. But its price point? Ridiculous. Its lineup? Tepid. Its killer app? A year away from launch. And they were so spooked by the Wii's motion control experiment that they hurriedly slapped a variation on it into the 6-axis controller, even though doing so cost the system rumble. The result of that? Gamers were pissed, and one of the key launch titles, Lair, was rendered unplayable. But while all this was going on, Sony didn't seem to care. It was as though they were more concerned with the PS3's use as a vehicle to push the new Sony-backed media format Blu-ray. Sound familiar? Who would consciously repeat the debacle of the PSP? Who would greenlight this ad campaign? Who would do any of this? Well, someone who just isn't any damn good at this stuff. Here's the rub, guys. I think we've been wrong. We've been kidding ourselves. The supposed era of Sony domination from the vantage point of hindsight looks an awful lot more like the era where Sony had no real competition. Now, that's not to take anything away from the games, I stress. Obviously, lots of great people made lots of great games on the PlayStations. But let's remember, we aren't talking about systems with radical controller setup like the Wii or proprietary interface like the cartridge era. Logically, all the games on Sony consoles would have been just as good on whoever else happened to have the top-selling machine at the time. And given that we've now seen how Sony stacks up next to a real game company at full power, or even a well-committed company with software experience and oodles of capital to spend, it probably would have been whoever else. So, there you go. 1994 to 2005. The age when Sony got lucky. So what does the future look like through this new enlightened prism? Well, Sony probably isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and things could always turn around, but right now it looks like their time at the top, or even near the top, is over with for a while. Thus, is this the conflict that now defines the future of gaming? I've got to admit, it's an intriguing prospect. Nintendo and Microsoft as Coke and Pepsi? Fascinating implications. It wouldn't merely be Mario versus Master Chief, it'd be a fundamental clash of histories, philosophies, and even countries. Japan versus America, Old Lion versus Young Tiger, the Japanese way of legacy-driven mascot epics, fan service, and niche spreading versus, this guy in a succession of different hats. Never said it was all good news. But then again, hey, remember when the console wars were fun to watch?